End of the line.
Thanks, Dad.
You head in there, Gumdrop. I'm gonna give Peter the dad talk.
Don't let him intimidate you. Love you.
Love you, Gumdrop.
Have a safe flight. You guys look so pretty.
Does she know?
Know what?
So she does it. Good. Close to the vest. I admire that. I've got a few secrets of my own. Of all the reasons I didn't want my daughter to date. Peter, nothing is more important than family. You saved my daughter's life, and I could never forget something like that, so I'm going to give you one chance. Are you ready? You walk through those doors, you forget any of this happened, and don't you ever interfere with my business again. Because if you do, I'll kill you and everybody you love. I'll kill you dead. That's what I'll do to protect my family, Pete. Do you understand? Hey, I just saved your life. Now what do you say?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Now, you go on in there, you show my daughter a good time, okay? Just not too good.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I'm welcoming a new guest and a fellow podcaster, and that is Alex Marcus. Alex, how you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I got my son here riding shotgun with me today because he's getting a little bit fussy right before we sat down to record. But other than that, I'm good, and he seems to be content right now. So before we get started talking about the movie, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so my name is Alex Marcus. I live in the United States. I have been podcasting for the last 6 years. First through my film podcast, Cinema Dros, where we have reviewed many a comic book movie over the years. And then about 3 years ago, I started working for thepopbreak.com. I'm their podcast editor. I kind of supervise their entire podcast network. And in that capacity, about a year ago, started hosting a podcast with the editor-in-chief of that website, Bill Bodkin, called Bill versus the MCU, where we rewatch the first 4 phases of the MCU. We did all of that in 11 months. And on the 12th month in December, we did a big Feige's Award special for all the highlights and lowlights of the MCU. And now we're just kicking off our second season where we're diving into the Defenders saga on Netflix. So we're reviewing select seasons of those shows, Daredevil, Jessica Jones, all that stuff. So you can find that podcast on Pop Break Today, the podcast feed. So.
Okay, awesome. What got you started in podcasting?
Well, I've been a listener of podcasts since early 2009. I'm not exactly the earliest of early adopters, but I definitely got into them sooner than most people I knew. For a number of years, I was like, "You guys have to check these podcasts out; they're really fun." And people would be like, "Yeah, whatever." And then all of a sudden, they took over the world. But so I've just had a passion for the format for a really long time, and it was always exciting to try to get a chance to do it myself. And when the opportunity came with a couple of friends to start a monthly film podcast, I took it, and from there it kind of opened up a lot of doors. So
very cool. And so the podcast you're on now, Bill versus the MCU, what brought up that idea to do that podcast? Because it sounds, just on paper, just the name of it sounds like it's you're dealing with someone who maybe wasn't really into the MCU at first, or had some comments about the MCU, or something like that. So tell me what the story is with that.
So the title is sort of a play off of that kind of like classic like Daredevil versus or Deadpool versus the Marvel Universe comic book series where he kind of like goes through and kills everybody. And Marvel has recycled that title for a couple of other characters in the last couple of years. But it basically came from the fact that Bill Bodkin, our editor-in-chief of the podpick.com, he hosts a weekly just general culture podcast for the site called Socially Distanced. And whenever there's a Marvel Disney Plus show in session, he will review weekly the episodes that come out. But he was way behind on the films. And for a long time, I was like, you got to catch up on the films. And he kind of got burnt out on the Marvel movies around 2016 and was like, this is just too much to keep track of. I can't deal with it anymore. And he just kind of gave up. But then he was reviewing all of the TV shows without a lot of the context. So finally one day I was like, look, you put me in charge of the podcasting network. And so I'm commissioning a podcast where once a month I make you watch all of the Marvel movies in chronological order until you're caught up. And so that's what we did. And he thanks me for it all the time because over the span of the year that we just completed, he kind of fell in love with them again. And now some of his favorite Marvel movies of all time are ones that we covered specifically for the site that he had not watched previously. So that was kind of the idea. And now we're going into the Defender Saga, which is a series of TV shows that he has never watched. And we have definitely gotten a lot of feedback over the last year. Oh, you got to do Daredevil. You got to do Jessica Jones. So that's what we're doing.
So how are you doing the Defender stuff? Are you doing it one episode of the show per episode of your podcast? Are you doing a handful of episodes?
Yeah, so we decided to devote the first 6 months of the year to the Defenders. So what that means is we're doing 6 episodes, 6 monthly, one a month, and we're covering one season each episode for us. So we're kind of, our first episode was Daredevil season 1. Then we're doing Jessica Jones season 1. We're not covering all of the seasons because, quality is a bit up and down on those shows. And the idea was we wanted to kind of prepare our audience and prepare Bill for these characters' possible introductions into the MCU over the next few years, because we know some of them might be popping up on Echo. We got the Daredevil Born Again show coming on that is going to feature a number of these characters. So we wanted to hit at least the character introductions for all of the main Defenders people. So that means Daredevil season 1, Daredevil season 2, where we meet the Punisher. Daredevil season 3, we're also going to be covering just because that's the most recent Daredevil season, and we're going to be getting a new Daredevil season, kind of. But then we're only doing the first season of Jessica Jones. We're only doing the first season of Luke Cage. We're doing the Defenders miniseries. We're not doing any Iron Fist because I promised Bill I wouldn't make him watch it. Even though I will say the second season of Iron Fist is better than people say, or at least expect.
I think it's much better. I'd also put a vote in for at least the Iron Fist episode of season 2 of Luke Cage, because when he appeared on Luke Cage, I thought it was the best that Finn Jones had done in the role.
Yeah, we're probably not going to do that, but we will definitely talk about it. What we've been able to do, which has been kind of fun, is get guests to come on and talk about their favorite characters along the way. And so we definitely we're planning on bringing on people who love these characters and can kind of help our audience know what they're missing if they don't follow along with the whole schedule and decide to, branch out. So hopefully we'll get to cover it at least in those conversations, but we'll definitely get to see Iron Fist in the Defenders at the very least. Right. Which, he's like the 5th lead of that show. So I think that's probably for the best.
Yeah. What about the Punisher? Are you going to cover any of those shows, even though it's tangentially connected to Defenders, but he wasn't part of that grouping?
Yeah, so we decided that we're going to be meeting the Punisher pretty prominently in season 2 of Daredevil, and we felt like that was probably enough for our audience, given the fact that those 2 seasons of the Punisher kind of have a pretty mixed reputation, and it's not clear how much of them would actually, factor into anything in the future. And we the plan was we wanted to get to in July, we're going to do a MCU check-in episode where we're going to talk about the most recent MCU installments that we've missed over the last few months, like Ant-Man and Secret Invasion. And the hope was we'd be able to review Echo. So we were trying to finish up the miniseries by the time Echo came out. Now it seems like Echo might not come out until the end of the year, so that kind of blew up the schedule a little bit. But we're just kind of sticking with the schedule we'd already decided because I'm a little bit anal retentive, and I've already created a podcast schedule for the next 3 years for this podcast. So I definitely I want to stick with it with the plan, because after we finish the Defender saga, we're going to be diving into some Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., which I'm very excited about because I'm a huge Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. fan, and Bill has, again, not watched any of it. So I can't wait. We're going to be curating that. We're going to be spending about 8 months on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., select arcs across several seasons. So,
and I'm guessing you're going to skip Inhumans entirely.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We are skipping all of the Inhumans. Yeah, we're gonna we're gonna be finding a way to do some of the Agent Carter seasons along with our Agents of Shield coverage, which I'm excited about because some of those
Mhm.
characters from that show factor in unexpectedly significantly towards the end of Agents of Shield. So we're gonna cover that stuff. But yeah, Inhumans, the TV show, not getting covered in our rundown. And honestly, a lot of the Inhuman stuff that happens on Agents of Shield is getting just skipped over.
You probably a good bet, I'd say. That was really when I started, I was really excited about Agents of Shield at first. Then when they got into the Inhuman series, that's when I just sort of was just kind of watching out of habit more than anything else.
Yeah,
And
I
during
did
those,
go and see the Inhumans premiere in IMAX in movie theaters. That was a mistake. I, and, that's what life is about. It's about learning from our mistakes. So I'm not going to
yeah.
do it again.
So what kind of was your introduction to superheroes and that kind of stuff? Were you a comics guy from way back, or was it
I
the movies
was
and TV shows?
Yeah, I was not a comics guy. I never have been a comics guy. I think I've only read one comic book in my whole life, and it was like a free
Mhm.
Iron Man comic that I got on my iPad for some reason at one point.
Mhm.
So not a comics book person. I think like a lot of your guests, I was born in the '90s, and for me it was Batman the animated series, Spider-Man the animated series, X-Men the
Mhm.
animated series, like that Fox lineup. Just totally hooked me as a kid, and those were the stories that I fell in love with. And it took a long time to even realize that they had anything to do with comic books because that was my entry point into that. It was like watching those cartoons and then watching the movies once the movies came out a little bit later. And then in college, just when I was supposed to be writing papers, just spending hours on Wikipedia being like, well, wait, what was up with that thing that happened in that one X-Men cartoon? Oh, there's a whole comic book arc that I could read about on
Mhm.
Wikipedia explaining what the deal was with that. So that kind of amplified my comics knowledge. And then I love the Geek History Lesson podcast, which is great about kind of covering comic book content in a very thorough way. And yeah, and then the modern movies as well. But yeah, so that's
Mhm.
really the entry point for me. It was Batman first, and then it was X-Men and Spider-Man shortly thereafter that kind of hooked me into the whole superhero genre, along with the Power
Awesome.
Rangers. I gotta respect Power
Yep.
Rangers. That was the
Uh,
coolest show on TV when I was 7, and
Absolutely. In fact, I gotta plug my buddy's show. Anthony Desiato hosts Summoning the Zords, Power Rangers fan podcast. I contributed to the artwork, the cover artwork for that. So anyone's
very
interested in more
cool.
Power Ranger stuff, yeah, I think it's coming out every 2 weeks. So that show it's a fairly new show. It just came up like it's only got a few episodes so far, but it's really good. He's been on the show a few times, so definitely check that out as well for anyone who's interested
Yeah.
in more Power
It's
Ranger stuff.
definitely cooler to say that I got started on X-Men and Spider-Man, but I would be lying if I didn't give some credit to Power Rangers because that was definitely my favorite of all of those shows back when I was a kid.
I mean, I was at that age when Power Rangers came out where it was not cool to like Power Rangers in my age group, so I
Mm.
like had to it was I had to keep it secret from all my friends basically back then. But yeah, I definitely went through the Power Rangers phase. I definitely had all the toys and stuff. And I live in Japan, so here it's Super Sentai. And whenever I'm in any of these recycle shops, they have like the Super Sentai toys and stuff. So I always take a peek and see if they have any of the stuff that made it over to Power Rangers and check the prices on them just out of curiosity.
Yeah, well, that Super Sentai stuff is crazy because I remember like learning about in high school, like way after I
Mhm.
should have, that was the Power Rangers just a composite of a Japanese show and
Mhm.
American super low budget show, and that
Yeah,
just
yeah.
like blew my mind in the moment. And then when you go back and watch, you're like, oh, that's why there's so many industrial parks in Southern California. Now it all makes sense.
Yeah. And why the Yellow Ranger's costume didn't have a skirt while the Pink Rangers did, because the Pink Ranger in the Super Sentai was the only female in the team.
Yes, yeah. In my head
So
at the
yeah.
time, I was just like, well, she's just the sporty girl, and that's the girl,
Yeah.
and that's the the girl that like dresses, and then the sporty girl makes sense.
Mhm. Anyway, another thing I do with guests lately is I ask them what are they kind of interested in, what's kind of grabbing their attention now. Not necessarily for your podcast or anything like that, because I know obviously you're into rewatching the MCU stuff for Bill versus the MCU, but just in general, what kind of stuff are kind of grabbing your interest now? Can be TV, movies, books, video games, comic. I know you're not a comic book guy, but anything like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, best movie of last year is Everything Everywhere All at Once, and that's definitely on the top of my list of favorite things that I've seen in the last year. I love that film. It just is getting re-released in theaters because of all the awards hype, and I'm excited to go back and watch it for a second time. Really wild to me that it's gotten so much Oscar attention, just because I
Mhm.
remember sitting in the theater in April being like, wow, that was an incredible movie. That movie feels like it was designed explicitly for me and me alone, and I can't imagine anyone else liking it as much as I do, but I'm so glad that I like it. And then, like, to see it go on where so many other people had such a deeply personal experience with the film and feeling similarly was very cool. And you know, I love Michelle Yeoh. I've loved her in a lot of stuff. I'm a Star Trek Discovery fan, and she is a iconic character on that show. And of course, you know, it's silly to name that as the first among on her credits because she's so accomplished. I mean, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, of course, is incredible. But yeah, so I'm very excited that that film continues to endure, and yeah, it's definitely the best. It's definitely the best film that I've seen. In terms of TV, Fleischman is in Trouble is a Hulu show that debuted in December with Jesse Eisenberg and Lizzie Kaplan and Claire Danes and Adam Brody that I just absolutely loved. It's a great kind of story about, you know, being in your 40s and kind of realizing that the life that you thought that you had isn't quite what you expected it to be. That's how it starts out, but it progresses to some interesting places where it really plays with perspective, and you realize that maybe Jesse Eisenberg, who plays the protagonist, isn't quite as honest of a protagonist as you might think, and he's maybe due to his own narcissism, kind of missing some of the key facts in his own life, and you need to see it from other people's perspective to get a full understanding of what's going on there. And I just love stories that play with perspective like that, and so that was a really exciting show that aired right at the end of last year that I think kind of went a little bit undersung. So I keep trying to tell people to check it out. Everyone who I've recommended it to and actually watched are very happy that I did so. So I definitely recommend people checking that out.
Very cool. I'm so jealous that I have not yet to see everything everywhere all at once because it has not come to Japan yet. It hasn't
Oh
come out.
no.
I think it's scheduled to come out on DVD here in the spring, but I got to double check that. So yeah, it's been annoying because everybody's been talking about it for the better part of a year now. I'm just like, God damn, I can't see it yet.
Yeah. Oh man. So you have to wait like literally a year to see it. That's unfortunate
Yeah.
because it's such an incredible film. It's so moving and emotional and relatable and silly and ridiculous
Mhm.
and creative. And I was a big the Daniels or the directing team that directed that, and I was a big fan of their prior film Swiss Army Man, which is a movie that most people know as the one where Harry Potter played a farting corpse, and that is certainly a big part of the movie, and it's a ridiculous, but it also is like this very kind of touching story about kind of like toxic masculinity and depression, and just like the fact, like the genius of these guys is that they're able to take the silly and absurd and ground it in a
Mhm.
deeply emotional and relatable place that ends up telling these like incredible stories that I think really resonate with a modern audience in a way that you just don't see. No one else makes movies like they do. So I'm really
Mhm.
excited by this success, and I can't wait to see what they do next.
Yeah, I'm so excited to see it. I hope it comes out here soon. For my part, what I've been watching, what I just started, I just watched the first episode of, and I'm not sure where this is in the US. It here in Japan, it's on Disney Plus as part of their Star package. So in the US, I think it might be on Hulu, but it's a Japanese TV show called it's like kind of like a horror mystery show called Gannibal. And I just started watching that. So if anyone watched Tokyo Vice, Sho Kasamatsu, who plays the young yakuza in Tokyo Vice, he's in that. He plays like this really creepy role in that. And then it's also got main actor is Yuya Yagira, who was in the Japanese Unforgiven, which is one of my favorite Japanese movies ever. He plays the main character. He plays this cop who's from like a metropolitan area who had some stuff happen in his past, and then he gets sent to this small town where he's like the only cop in the small town, and there's some weird stuff going on with the town. The last cop in that town, the show opens with him like accusing people of being cannibals, and then he just kind of like disappears, and so then we pick up a few months later with this new guy coming in. So I checked out the first episode because my wife is hooked on it, and I just really started getting interested in it based on that first episode, and I'm looking forward to watching more of it. So that's my thing. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of that yet. I don't even know I don't know if it's available anywhere in the US, but if it's on, check Hulu first, and it's called Gannibal, just like Hannibal with a G instead.
Okay, that sounds really cool. Yeah, I haven't heard of that. I'll have to check it out.
But now let's go ahead and move into the discussion of the movie. So you're coming on and really kind of completing this is the last of the Spider-Man movies that have been released so far outside of the Venom stuff. That we have not covered, and that is, well, and aside, the 1970 stuff with Nick Hammond as well, but as for the more recent stuff, we've got at the time we're recording this, we are doing the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire. That episode is in the queue to come out soon.
Okay.
And now we've got you coming on to kind of round us out with Spider-Man Homecoming.
Well, I'm very happy to be here to talk about Spider-Man: Homecoming, because I think I go back and forth, but if it's not my favorite of all the Spider-Man movies, it's really neck and neck with what ends up being the favorite. So I'm really excited that I get to be the one to close out this journey for you.
Yeah, my wife was asking me about this last night after we finished watching it. She's like, which Spider-Man movie is your favorite? And I was thinking about it. I'm like, you know what? I think it actually is Homecoming. I think this one definitely is my favorite of them. It's tough competition with Spider-Man 2, but I think the way Holland plays both Peter Parker and Spider-Man, plus just the Liz and MJ are just a lot more likable in this movie than MJ was in Spider-Man 2. So I think those things just kind of elevate it just a little bit more, and that's why I think I would put this one at the top.
Yeah, and for me, it's kind of like I loved the Tobey Maguire movies when they came out. They were so game changing for me, and I mean, the first one came out, I was 12 years old, and that was just like, wow, like a movie could be like. And I remember like being at my cousin's house and everybody being like, wow, the Spider-Man movie, have you heard about it? Like people who didn't care about like the cartoon or anything superheroes, and realizing like, oh wow, this is like a big deal, and seeing that take off was so cool, and watching the development of Spider-Man 2 in real time. I remember like looking up like Entertainment Weekly, like getting those magazines and like reading the kind of like, oh, this is what to expect from the new movie, and like what they were thinking about. And that was like one of the first times that I even had that experience as a young person. And so those movies are really close to me, but when I rewatch them, man, there's just a lot of stuff about them that just don't work for me. Like Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker, I know people like to say like, oh, he's the best Peter Parker, but I think he's such a creep in those movies in a lot of ways. Like he has this weird entitlement thing with MJ that just really doesn't age well, I don't think. Like there's like this sort of like toxic nerd thing that is in there that I don't know if they realize how poorly that is aged, given like the cultural climate that we live in now, unfortunately. So that really holds me back from loving those movies as much. And the Andrew Garfield movies, you spent many hours talking about both of those, and God bless you for that. There are things to admire about them. The Andrew Garfield Emma Stone connection is undeniable and incredible, and I just wish that they had made a sort of musical rom-com instead of a Spider-Man movie, because I think we could all appreciate that more. But so for me, it's like the Tom Holland movies are just far and away the best of the set of Spider-Man movies that we've gotten. And yeah, it's kind of a neck and neck thing for me between Homecoming and No Way Home. For a long time, I was like, Homecoming is it. And then the more that I rewatched No Way Home, and I listened to your episode about it, I know you have kind of mixed feelings on it, but it's just such an emotional wallop for me every time that I watch it. And I think ultimately it has higher highs, but I really love this movie as well. And I think it's such a quintessential Spider-Man movie in a way that so few of the Spider-Man things we've gotten over the years actually is, which is part of why it's so great.
I think with No Way Home, when I focus on the story, that's really when my mixed opinions start to come into it. But when I just sit down to watch it, like if we're talking about just as an experience, then I think No Way Home might be more entertaining. But when it comes to, when I'm thinking about the story and all that, then Homecoming becomes better. But you made a good point. And I realized this last night when I was watching Homecoming, and every time I watch these movies, I end up comparing them in my head to all the other Spider-Man movies and all the other Spider-Man performances. Because that's just
so
the way
hard
my
not
brain
to.
works. It's so hard not to. Yeah. And you made a good point about the the Tobey Maguire as Peter Parker thing, because I'm one of those people who does stand, and I stand by this, that I think Tobey Maguire was a great Peter Parker, not so great as Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield was the opposite. He was a great Spider-Man, not so great as Peter Parker. Although you made a good point, and this kind of I realized this when I was thinking about comparing these movies in my head last night. Even though Tobey Maguire is a better Peter Parker, and even though Andrew Garfield is a better Spider-Man, for some reason, those movies, the Maguire movies, the Spider-Man stuff was actually the stronger part of those movies, whereas in the Garfield movies, the Peter Parker stuff was the stronger part. But you had the actors who were weaker at both those parts playing those characters. And it was this weird kind of dichotomy, because the Raimi movies, God love them for everything they did. I remember too when that first one came out, it was my senior year in high school, and my friends and I, we'd always get together on weekends to go to the movies or something like that. And this is before like the internet really kind of blew up and made it easier to buy tickets online. So back then, if we wanted to get tickets in advance, we'd have to go to the theater to buy them. And I remember just having to be the one in my friends group who was trying to organize. Like, so many people wanted to see this movie, and it was insane. We had like a group of like 20 people going to see Spider-Man. Like, I never would have imagined that would have happened before that movie came out. Which, like you said, just goes to show how big that movie was at the time. And yeah, when I rewatch them now, you're right. There is that scene when it's so, because he's like gaslighting MJ the entire time of that movie when he says, "I can't be with you, but let me read you poetry and talk about." And I'm like, what are you doing?
It's like, they're trying to do the thing that like the comic books, I understand, do, and other medium has done, where it's like, I love you, but I can't be with you because that's not I'll be putting you in danger. But in reality, like when you apply that to like an actual human being and human relationships, it's incredibly toxic to be like, I love you, but I can't be with you, but I don't want you to be with anybody else, but you can't be with me. Like, that's just not good in terms of, and it's like, it works, I think on the page, it works within the conceit of the superhero thing because of, our established things. But when you like actually think about them as real people, you're just like, no, girl, get away from him. He's a nightmare. Marry J. Jonah Jameson's son. He seems like a very nice man. You'll have a nice
That's another thing that annoys me about that movie is like, John Jameson is the nicest guy on the planet, and he ends up getting. He even says, "Why don't you invite your friend Peter Parker to the wedding?" I'm like, Jesus Christ, this guy is way too nice. And then she ditches him at the altar. I'm like, that ending always irritates me every time I watch that movie. And to your point, yeah, I thought the Garfield things, I thought they did a better job of handling that whole "I love you, but I can't be with you" thing, because it came from her father. So he's conflicted about, I want to respect your father's last wishes, but I still care about you. And I thought there's still criticisms to be had about the way they did that, but I still think they handled it in a much better way. Which again, it's weird.
And not to interrupt you, but in that one, it's also, there's such palpable chemistry between those two actors that you can believe a lot more that like they know that it's wrong intellectually, but they feel so drawn to each other that they can't help it. Which I think the movie is smart to then try to build that into the central conceit of their relationship. But it's like that works because those people, when they're on screen together, you're just like, there's like a magnet between the two of them that you can't pull them away, right? That is not the vibe between Toby and Kirsten in those other movies.
Oh, completely well said. 100% co-sign on that. And again, that's why it's so weird that you've got the best Spider-Man stuff taking place in the movie with the actor who is not as good at the Spider-Man things, while the best Peter Parker stuff happens in the movie with the guy who's not as good at the Peter Parker stuff. And I really do wonder what would have happened if they had switched the actors for those different franchises. But the Tom Holland movie, Homecoming. Well, before we jump too much into it, what were your opinions about it when you first saw this movie, and then what were kind of your opinions when you watched it again this time?
Well, when I first saw this movie, I loved it. For one thing, when he appeared in Civil War, I was like, perfect. Like, this is perfect Peter Parker, perfect Spider-Man. They nailed it. We have been really at that point, and I know in your Far From Home episode, you kind of talked about all the machinations behind the scenes of how that happened and why.
Mhm.
So I don't think we need to get into that again, but I think the fan base, at least, was really enthusiastic about getting control of Spider-Man away from Sony at all costs and bringing them into the MCU, which at that
Mhm.
point had like a flawless track record. And so when he appears and he steals Cap's shield and he has that scene in his apartment with Iron Man, it's just like it all feels so exactly what you hoped, like surpassed your wildest expectations. So the hype of then the very next year getting a Spider-Man movie with Tom Holland in the lead was really exciting, and I really liked him as an actor even outside of Spider-Man. Like he's really good in The Lost City of Zed, which is a kind of small James Gray movie from just before he got cast in Spider-Man, where he plays Charlie Hunnam's son. He's really good in that. He's really good in The Impossible. So he was a young actor that was already on my radar as like a person to watch out for, and getting him to see him in this role and to see him just completely nail it in Civil War made me so excited to see it. And I ended up watching it 2.5 times opening weekend, which is not something that I typically do. The half time was because I had to wake up early the next day, so I went and I stayed until the ferry set
Mhm.
piece, and then I left because I was like, I have to go to bed. But yeah, so I loved this movie when it came out. I watched it 6 times over the years, and I like it every single time. And I just think that it has this excellent balance, which I'm sure we'll get into, of the kind of low stakes like neighborhood stuff, the relatable teen stuff, and then the kind of superhero stuff. And that's like you
Mhm.
want all three of those things to hit when you're talking about a teen superhero like Peter Parker. And I feel like we've never really gotten that before
Mhm.
in a way that works outside of some of the cartoons and stuff. So it's just, I think it's just so well balanced, and it just like it has the room to breathe, to let scenes kind of linger, to really establish the world of the MCU from the ground, which I think is a really cool opportunity that they get to do here, after spending a decade building it out from the top. And
Mhm.
yeah, there's just so many things I love. You know, Michael Keaton that is one of the best villains of all time in this movie, and of course, you know, he was Batman, so that's an extra level of fun. But yeah, I mean, I could talk about this movie forever. What did you think about this movie when you first saw it?
I loved it. Like just like you, I was so impressed with Tom Holland in Civil War, and I'm just like, oh my god, he gets it. He gets both those aspects of the character. Because like we'd said before, Toby, I thought he had gotten the Peter Parker stuff, but he wasn't so good at Spider-Man. And Andrew Garfield, God love him. The guy he's too charming to be Peter Parker, right? He's just and that was the biggest thing. I'm just like, you'd mentioned the episodes we did with Kellen Conley, and Kelly even pointed out, he's like, yeah, you're looking at Peter Parker, you're just like, man, I wish Peter was my friend. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly how you feel when you watch him in those movies, because you can't help but love Andrew Garfield in those movies. He's such a great, he just seems like such a great guy. And so so it's hard to buy him as like the put a pound outcast, the loner, unless he's doing it by choice. And whereas Tom Holland, he's got this whole, he's got that whole nerdy, youthful exuberance thing, but he's also got the humor and all that, which he does a very good job of making the humor seem nervous. Like Andrew Garfield, he always seems super confident as Spider-Man, and whereas Tom Holland, it feels like he's being humorous because he's covering up how terrified he is, which is one of the reasons why Spider-Man's always making jokes in the comics. So I love that he got that aspect of the character. So, and when I actually saw Homecoming and you got to see him, I have some quibbles with some of the choices they made in regards to the supporting cast. But overall, I thought it was this great blending of those two aspects of it, because you can't do Spider-Man without also focusing on the Peter Parker aspect of it. And it's really hard in movies to do that, because you've got this limited run times. And I've always maintained that, honestly, I think the best way to handle Spider-Man would be in a TV series, because then you could actually let the relationship drama and the character interactions play out and breathe a little bit more, because it's always been about that balancing act between the superhero stuff and the personal life. And you can't really do that it's very difficult to do that in the movies. So, and I think that was the weakness of the Raimi films and also the Mark Webb films, which is, like I was saying, you had some great Spider-Man stuff in the Raimi films, you had some great Peter Parker stuff in the Webb films, but they kind of dropped the ball on the other stuff. Whereas this one, it found that sweet spot. It was able to bring those two sides of his life together in a way that actually worked very well and didn't feel contrived, surprisingly.
Yeah, and I think it's a credit to I mean, this is a movie that has like 6 credited screenwriters, which is usually a
Mhm.
disaster when it comes to studio movies. That means that, they're running through a bunch of different drafts of the script and people are pulling things out and and putting things in. And usually it just becomes kind of like a zombie movie where you're just like, what is even happening? Like, they definitely lost the thread. And in this movie, like, it all works. Like, they kept all of the best pieces, I guess, because it all feels like a one coherent vision of who this character is. And I mean, I'm sure that's a credit to Feige most of all as the producer on this. But I just think, like, when we talk about the balance of the two Peters and Peter and Spider-Man and how it works so well here, something that jumps out to me is there's a scene when he is kind of investigating the criminal element in the
Mhm.
suburbs for the first time, and there he's observing, and then his phone goes off, which is like classic kind of like teen comedy sort of situation, like, oh no, he has a silly ringtone and whatever. And then they like pull a gun on Donald Glover, thinking that he's behind the kind of that he's double crossed them in some way. And Peter just jumps down, says like, hey, if you're gonna pull a gun, put it on me. Like, if you're gonna shoot somebody, shoot me. Like, without even thinking, just like that instinct of like, I'm a hero, I need to de-escalate the situation, and I'm gonna take the bullet if I need to. Perfect. Fast forward to like the third act of the movie. He's standing next to Liz, his love interest, and he wants to tell her that he likes her, and he is so terrified of doing that he can't even look her in the face. He has to kind of like look
Mhm.
forward as he's standing next to her. And it just, like, that's what Spider-Man is, right? Like, he can jump in front of a bullet without thinking, but he can't tell a girl that he likes her by looking at her in the eyes because he's too nervous, because he's still just a kid. And it's like,
Mhm.
it's so hard to make that feel real and grounded and not feel contrived or silly. And I think it helps that Tom Holland is like 21 when 22 when he's making these movies, and he feels like a teenager in a
Mhm.
way that the other Spider-Men haven't. They're like, they get cast when they're 25, they're 28 by the time they make the first movie, they feel like they're 35.
Mhm.
So I think that it really helps, but it also just, he manages to put all of that together and make it feel like one coherent person in a way that shouldn't work, and it does, and it does excellently.
Well, yeah, I mean, think the high school stuff, they use it because the high school stuff, it was, almost a footnote in the first movie, right? You have him, he's in high school, just basically in that opening sequence. It's like, what, 15, 20 minutes long. And then after that, he's in college. And in the Amazing Spider-Man movies, the first one, he was in high school the whole time, and then he graduates at the beginning of the second movie, but they don't really use the high school stuff to that great effect. Whereas this one, they I've always described this movie as like if John Hughes directed a superhero movie, because that's what it feels like. They really use that high school aspect of it to a lot of great effect in this. Um, and yeah, like you said, like that scene when he's, well, also what I love about his interactions with Donald Glover, who for anyone who doesn't recognize the character's name, his name's Aaron Davis, and he mentions he's got a nephew. He's Miles Morales' uncle, and if you've watched Into the Spider-Verse, that character is the one who becomes the Prowler in that movie.
Yeah.
Um,
And actually, not to interrupt, but they even have like an Easter egg when Peter is looking at him through his like heads up display, where it says on the screen that his code name, his alias is the Prowler.
oh, okay,
So that's
I
like,
missed that.
yeah. So it's like a little bit of an Easter egg that like that is like he's already established as that in this world. We don't really ever get to see him again, so it doesn't really add up to much. But who knows? In the future, he might pop back
Mhm.
up. So, but it's a fun Easter egg.
Well, also as a note, as another Easter egg, the whole reason Miles Morales was created was actually because of Donald Glover. Because
Hmm.
back when they were planning the Amazing Spider-Man, Mark Bernardin, who co-hosts Fat Man Beyond with Kevin Smith and is a screenwriter in his own right, he had wrote this article saying that there's no reason why Spider-Man can't be black, right? He's being raised by his aunt and his uncle. His parents are out of the picture. He grew up in Queens. He's, from a lower socioeconomic background. His story could easily be the story of a black kid from Queens. And Donald Glover was a huge Spider-Man fan, and he had actually, there's a big internet campaign to cast him as Spider-Man. Even so much so that in Community, there's an episode where he's wearing like Spider-Man pajamas or something. It's kind of a nod to that. And then Brian Michael Bendis, who was writing Ultimate Spider-Man at the time in the comics, he took a cue from that, and then he decided, well, we've got Peter Parker in the main universe. this is the Ultimate Universe, so let's kill Peter Parker and let's bring in a new Spider-Man and we'll make him black. And that ended up being Miles Morales. So it's really cool that all of this stuff comes full circle, and we get to have Donald Glover playing some role in connection to Miles Morales in the movies as well.
Yeah,
Um,
it's. I mean, in the moment, that was so exciting, and it's funny because like this movie comes out in 2017, and I feel like by 2018, Donald Glover had reached like a whole nother threshold
mhm,
of kind of superstardom with like Atlanta becoming one of the most celebrated television series of the decade, and his Childish Gambino music career really taking off in a serious way, whereas before it was kind of like a little bit of a joke
mhm.
during his Community days, and like that he just and then he was in a Star Wars movie and he just kind of became king of the world for a couple years there, and so it was like this was probably the last time he could have shown up in a Spider-Man movie as a cameo
Mhm.
without it without it feeling very different. So it's funny to look back at it now and be like, oh yeah, they
It-
did this because they wanted to, like there was a fan campaign to make him Spider-Man. Like it's hard to
mm.
even remember that because his public persona has changed so much since then.
It's funny you mentioned the Childish Gambino thing is funny because every time when we were watching this movie, my wife was like, she's like, "Oh, it's Childish Gambino." I'm like, "Who?" I'm like, "Oh, right, Donald Glover," because I don't know him at all from his music. I know him
Yeah.
as an actor. I know him from Community and all that. So whenever we see him in something, she's like, "Oh, that's Childish Gambino," and me, I'm like, "It's Donald Glover." Um,
That's Troy
and
from
but
Community. Yeah.
yeah, that's who he's always going to be Troy from Community for me. That's who I always associate him with. Um, but one of the things I love about that scene when Peter goes to interrogate him with the enhanced interrogation mode is when he's just so obviously not intimidating at all, and Davis is not having any of it. Like he slams the trunk door, and Peter flinches, and he's like, this is your first time doing this, right? And he's like, you've got to get better at this part of the job. And that's another thing I love is that, it shows that, Peter's still a kid. He's just making this up as he goes along. He doesn't really know what he's doing. And I thought that scene really kind of captured that idea.
Yeah, and I feel like it's such a smartly written movie in that respect, where you start out like Peter has been part of this like massive superhero melee fight in Civil War, right? And he's like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm one of the Avengers now. I just need to wait for Tony Stark to call. I'm ready for this. I'm so At one point he literally says like, I'm so beyond high school right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then of course that line is received with a smash cut to him being sent to detention for skipping out on class. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like he's not, right? And that's the whole tension of this movie, is that, and it's so relatable. I think if you remember being a teenager, and if you have teenagers in your life, you will know this, that there is just this thing where like they feel like they are adults and they should be treated like adults, and yet they aren't adults in a very real way, right? They just
Mm-hmm.
don't. They have a lot of the things that adults have, but they don't have a handle on their impulse control, right? They don't have a handle on, they just don't have the experience that you need to be put in adult situations yet. And like the only way you can really gain that experience is by failing. And in
Mm-hmm.
this movie we get to see Spider-Man fail a lot,
A
and I
lot,
think
yeah.
that's really brave of them, because in a superhero movie, the superhero is supposed to win. He's supposed to be cool, and he's supposed to be tough, and he's supposed to win all of the fights, and maybe one thing goes wrong at the end of the second act to kind of raise the stakes for the act 3. But otherwise, like that's what a superhero movie is supposed to be. And in this movie he's failing constantly, he's making mistakes constantly, his heart is in the right place, but he's constantly doing the wrong thing. But
Mm-hmm.
every time that he does the wrong thing, he's learning from those experiences, to the point where when he's in the climax, he is becoming the person that he needs to be to finally beat the Vulture and save the day. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that that's just so smart. It's so well written, and that narrative progression is so, it's exactly what you want from a teen superhero. And I just
Mm-hmm.
think it's really impressive, because it's absolutely not the sort of thing that we got in previous Spider-Man movies.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think this movie also, it does a great job of utilizing the different aspects and what's been established of the MCU to be get up until this point. Because in the comics, when Spider-Man came out, right, you had the Fantastic Four were already established, and so I was getting flashbacks to some of those old early Lee Ditko issues when he's like fantasizing about joining the Fantastic Four, and he's like going and auditioning to them in a very kind of like, you know, dickish kind of way. And I'm like, and one of the things that drives me nuts about this movie is a lot of the discourse around it. Like Spidey Twitter is infuriating because it's just like they seem to hate everything involving Spider-Man, which is just ridiculous. And a lot of the complaints about this movie in particular, I think, are kind of misplaced. Like they, one of the things they say is like, oh, well, Peter cares more about being an Avenger than about responsibility. I'm like, well, one of the through lines about pretty much every single Spider-Man story is he's constantly relearning that lesson about power and responsibility. It's never been like
Right.
he's always responsible all the time. Peter's always screwing up. He's always making the wrong choice and then having to fix it later. And I thought this movie completely played into that.
He's a kid. He thinks he's being responsible when he goes to the Staten Island ferry and tries to break up that arms deal and like ignores his aunt and ignores Tony. He thinks he's being responsible. He thinks this is the most responsible choice that I could make in this situation. Anything else would be irresponsible. How could I not try to save the day? And the problem is not that he's being irresponsible. The problem is that he's not thinking through his actions because he's 15 years old. Of course, he's not thinking through his actions, right?
Yeah.
He's just so overeager. He's constantly like over his skis on stuff. And that is just so exactly what a teenage superhero who really cares about responsibility would act like, because he's overestimating his own ability to handle the situation. He's not trying to be reckless. He doesn't leave the room for him to be reckless in the situation because he's like, no, I'll handle this. I'm the best person for this situation. I'm going to solve the problem. And it's like, oh no, you just made the problem so much worse. And I think that a lot of that also it's in the writing, but it's also in Tom Holland's performance. You never feel like his heart is not in the right place, right? He always feels like he's trying to do the right thing. And like when it comes to the Avengers thing, it's like that's him not necessarily not caring about his community or anything else. That's him being like, I'm ready to be a real superhero. So that way I could really make a difference, because he feels that sense of responsibility. There's an urgency to wanting to be on that stage because he feels like that's what he needs to do in order to help the most people. It's not the vanity of it, but there is a little bit of vanity because he's also a teenager. And so it all gets kind of like mixed in. And I think that is exactly right. I think that's the perfect way to use this character.
I agree. I agree 100%. In fact, that scene when he leaves the room, I didn't realize it before, but that is such a great quintessential Spider-Man moment. And they do even me is like, I'm almost 40 and I watch this movie and it reminds me of what it was like to be in high school. Like I remember those times when you were out on a school trip and you were sneaking out of the room to go to the pool and all that with the other classmates and all that. And I remember those things. I remember those, and watching him sneak out and then look in and see them all in the pool and just kind of like being wistful, and it's that right there. It's perfect, like the
Spider-Man
while he's dressed in the costume. Like that is perfect Spider-Man right there. Exactly. Yeah.
Like, and I don't know how you're a lifelong Spider-Man fan and you don't recognize that is perfect Spider-Man. Exactly. That is the tension of the character. He has a line later where he says, just a typical homecoming on the outside of an invisible jet fighting my girlfriend's dad, right? Like that's what the character is. And this movie captures that perfectly.
That's a good transition because I did want to talk about Michael Keaton's Vulture next. I think I was also thinking, comparing in my head, like different Spider-Man villains we've seen so far. And with the exception of probably Dr. Octopus, I think the MCU movies have given us the best interpretation of these villains. And like what they did with Vulture in this movie or Mysterio in the next one, and Vulture especially, I thought it was brilliant to use something that actually connects to the character's name, right? He's scavenging for all these parts and stuff like that. Make him a literal scavenger. And having Michael Keaton play that part, it's perfect. And Vulture in the comics never had a whole lot of depth, but they bring so much depth to that character in this movie, and connecting it way back to the first movie and the first Avengers movie and the Chitauri invasion and all this stuff with damage control and the whole class struggle-ish thing. All of that was done. Oh my God. It's so well done in this movie.
Yeah, and I think Michael Keaton as an actor is just obviously extremely talented, and he's
Hmm.
able to bring a lot of gravity to the role, a lot of relatability to the role. He feels like a very accessible character. You really want to root for him, even when he's making the wrong choice, right? You understand where he's coming from, and he also feels believably as like Peter's girlfriend's dad too, and just like the
Hmm.
normal menace of that experience, just going to your girlfriend's house and having to deal with their dad being kind of like, I'm joking, but I'm not, that kind of
Hmm.
vibe. Like he plays that perfectly too. And then, of course, like as that scene escalates, it becomes this like incredibly heightened comic booky version of what that would be. But yeah, the choice to do that with the Vulture, which is really, I mean, again, I didn't read the comic books. Maybe he has some incredible arcs in the comics that I'm not familiar with, but I remember him from the 90s cartoon. And I remember, like, in the 90s cartoon, he was positioned as Felicia Hardy's dad, which I don't think is true in the comic books. I think that was an adaptation choice. But I remember he mostly was just around in this, like, big, epic, multi part story where he was trying to, like, use science and an ancient,
Hmm.
like, relic to make him be young again. And that's, like, all he cared about. That is not interesting from a storytelling perspective.
Hmm.
And I remember he was going to be the villain in Spider-Man 4, and he was going to be John Malkovich, and it was like all set and ready to go. And then that movie fell apart after it got greenlit because Spider-Man 3 was such a huge success, and then it fell apart quickly thereafter when everyone realized like, oh no, actually people hate this movie, even though it made a bunch of money.
Hmm.
Um, but that was always like, I don't really want to see the Vulture. And so then for when they said, okay, well, it's going to be the Vulture, but it's going to be Michael Keaton, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to see Michael Keaton in this. I'll see what he does with this character, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be a very interesting role. And what they do with him is just great. It works so well
Hmm.
as sort of like working class version of shadow self to Tony Stark, and the impact that that has on Peter, and like the twist is excellent. What was your
Hmm.
experience with the twist when you first saw it?
Oh, and I'm talking about the first time I saw this movie. Man, that twist had me jumping out of my seat. I'm like, holy! Like I was not expecting that. Not at all. And and it's just such a. There's this old joke about the Spider-Man comic books. Like if you want to be the best way to be a Spider-Man villain is to know Peter Parker because every single one of his villains comes from his personal life in some way. Uh, and it's a contrived thing about Spider-Man comic books and stuff, but I thought it worked so well, and they do that here, like, but it works so well in this movie, and just that twist of like that, it's a perfect way to illustrate that, using superhero being a superhero and tying it into high school. Um, I've talked about this before, but one of the things I loved about Buffy was those early seasons where they really leaned into that metaphor of high school as a horror movie, and they did different aspects of it, trying to find horror movie twists on these typical high school tropes. And I thought doing that with the superhero movie and what they do here, where that idea of like, oh my god, the greatest villain you're ever going to face is your girlfriend's dad, and then having that being where he is actually the supervillain of the story too. I mean, that is my favorite sequence in this movie, bar none, and that is the creepiest sequence in probably any MCU movie. Is that scene where he's there in the house and he's talking to Michael Keaton, and Michael Keaton's waving the knife around and stuff, and Michael Keaton's just the look on his face in general. He looks like a creepy guy in general. Like if I was going to, if I was a teenager and I was going to pick up my girlfriend and that guy answered the door, I'd be creeped out too, even if I didn't know he was a super villain.
No, absolutely. But what I like about it is that it's just on the right side of believability for like
Mhm.
a kind of a dad who's trying to kind of like scare his girlfriend, his daughter's boyfriend a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Like it doesn't tip over the line too much. Like there's a way to play it where it's like, where like it's Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn, for instance.
Mhm.
Like that man is like a lunatic from beginning to end. Like you're never
Mhm.
surprised when it turns out he's the guy on the glider running around throwing bombs at people. But
Yeah.
with Michael Keaton, it's like this feels like a dad who's trying to intimidate his daughter's boyfriend and doing a good job, and then it turns in the car
Mhm.
to when he starts to put the pieces together, and then he feels like not just a dad but a supervillain, and it's like, and
Mhm.
that transition is just perfect. And when
It's
I was watching
masterful.
it this time around, I noticed that there's like they do this thing where like he's asking questions, they're in the car, and every little bit of information is like, that's interesting. Oh, Spider-Man. Oh, you weren't in the elevator with everybody in DC. Like,
Mhm.
and you're like, okay. And you see it kind of putting it together, and then when he finally realizes it, which is a great touch that I never noticed before. He's sitting at the light, and the light turns green. It's red while he's figuring things out, and then it turns green, which is not only like, oh, it's a go, I realized it, but also like green is his like supervillain color, right? So the green flashes across his face, and he like looks like the Vulture now in a way, and it's just like that attention to detail is so fun, and it's really, this film is just so full of things that you really appreciate more and more the more times you watch it. It's got real rewatchability value.
I love how, yeah, he does so much with this performance. Like, I love that scene in the house. Like you said, it's just the typical, you know, dad is trying to needle his girlfriend's, his daughter's boyfriend, and just like the little setups he gives him, like he's like, you look a little bit pale, Pete. You want a drink? You want a scotch or a bourbon or something? He's like, no, I'm not old. He's like, that's the right answer. Yeah. He's like, look at her. Doesn't she look beautiful? It's like, yeah. Also the right answer. Good job. He's like, I'm gonna be your show. Like, it's just like he's playing it perfectly, because he is just, you can tell that he's just doing this to mess with Peter. He's just having fun with them a little bit. And then calling him Pedro and all that. And then when it turns, when he's in the car, and Michael Keaton actually, he brings a real sincerity to the way he deals with Peter. Like, he says to him when he, after they drop her off, and he turns to him with the gun, and he's like, I admire what you're doing. I admire that you're playing it close to the vest. You saved my daughter's life. I'm not going to forget that. So I'm going to give you a way out. Like, all of that makes perfect sense why he would decide to let Peter go in that moment. He's like, look, you're a kid. You don't really understand what's going on here. So I'm giving you one chance to leave this alone. And you get the feeling, even when, Pete comes to him in the lair, and, he's just kind of talking to him very casually. You get the feeling that, Adrian actually does have some admiration and respect for Peter. I thought they did a good job of playing that.
Yeah, I fully agree. And like, they get away with the sort of like, we're not so different, you and I, villain monologue, which is like maybe the most cliche thing you could do in a comic book movie or action movie of all time at this point. And yet it just, when you have two good actors who get to deliver those lines, like, they make it feel real, and they make it feel vibrant, and they make it feel like it's part of what the movie is actually trying to communicate, not just a really hacky cliche. So it's impressive. And I will say another thing about like the development of this movie in relation to its villains. This movie, obviously, it was primarily produced by Marvel, right? Marvel Studios, but it had some Sony input. I feel like the Sony input kind of gets a little bit underplayed now, but it was definitely a collaborative experience. And one of the things that Sony apparently was really pushing Marvel to do is to like include more villains, right? We can't just have one villain. And I remember when we were getting news about this movie before it came out, of like, oh, it's not just going to be the Vulture. It's going to have the Shocker. No, it's going to have two Shockers, and it's going to have the Tinkerer. It's going to have the Scorpion. And I remember thinking like, oh no, they're doing it again. They're overloading this movie with villains and plots and things that it's going to be a disaster. And then when you watch the movie, it just works perfectly, because it's like they never lose track of the story that they're telling, which is so key when you're talking about populating your world. And so it never feels like, oh, here's every villain has their own story and their own arc and their own thing, and they have to come together, and you're constantly dividing your attention. No, instead, all of these comic book characters that audiences have more or less familiarity with, depending on where they're coming in with the property. They are able to just use these characters to populate the world and flesh out the world to make it feel real, and to make it feel like it's full of different interesting types of people who are just on the edges and working on the corners of the screen. And that ends up being an enriching experience. We have that with the teen characters too. There's lots of teen characters who are like, comic book fans know their names, but here they're just there to support Peter and to support his story. Like, everything is working towards one goal, which is to tell this specific story about Peter learning how to become a superhero on his own right, and respect his limits, and make friends, and tackle the bad guy without losing who he is, right? That's the point of this story, and every single piece of it works towards that. And it's really impressive that they pull that off.
I'm glad you mentioned the other villains, because I did want to talk about that. And I think Marvel did something smart when they approached those other villains, because not every Spider-Man villain is on the level of like a Dr. Octopus or a Green Goblin. So like, you combine
or
Green
Rhino,
Goblin,
or
Rhino, I'd say Rhino's exactly what I'm thinking of. Because I remember people were complaining about Rhino in Amazing Spider-Man 2 because they're throwing too many villains in there. I actually thought he worked fine in that small role he had in that because he's just this, this small side villain that so it kind of gives you this feeling of this is the kind of stuff Peter deals with every day as opposed to every 2 years a new villain pops up. Um,
Uh-huh.
so I really think that it helps out that way to show that it shows you that, he's dealing with these different threats all the time. It's not just every 2 years one big villain pops up and that's who he has to deal with. So I think I thought that they did that pretty well in that movie. And in this one too, you're not going to have a movie where the Shocker is the headlining villain or where the Scorpion is the headlining villain. So, or the Tinkerer, right? So working them into into these smaller roles in this movie, I thought was a really smart choice. And it gives the fans of the comic books being like, oh, that's the Shocker. Oh, that's the Tinkerer. All that made I thought that was all really well done.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think like they actually made the Vulture look intimidating and scary, which is
Oh yeah.
incredible. Because I mean, again, I don't see the comic book. I don't know. Maybe there's other iterations of his costuming in the comic books that looks scarier. But I know from the cartoon that I watched that he is just this old man in a green kind of like mechanized jet suit with like actual feather wings attached, and he looks completely ridiculous. And here they give him like this bomber jacket look that he's kind of like in a flight suit, but kind of not. And he does literally have he gets the kind of like wing kind of breastplate still, but like within the context of the bomber jacket. And he gets this like mask that he genuinely looks imposing and intimidating. And it's like, how did you make the Vulture scary? That's insane. It's really impressive. The kind of production design that they went into and costume design that went into making that guy actually work as a cinematic villain.
Oh yeah, I thought the working in the fur collar and when he has it zipped up because the Vulture's classic comic costume in the comics, it does have like this fur collar around it, just like a Vulture. So I thought that was a nice little touch. It's like, oh, we're adding just that little thing to connect it to the comic books, and it works very well, like you said, in the context of that bomber jacket. The Shocker too, right? Same idea with him with like the yellow sleeves and all that. That's a nod to his look in the comics. So all that stuff. Or we don't see the Scorpion in costume or anything, but we see it. He's got the tattoo on his neck and all that, so we know who he is. So again, all that stuff works very well. You'd mentioned the supporting cast, and I want to talk a little bit about them because I thought the supporting cast works so well in this movie. Although I did find myself wondering why they kind of chose the characters they did, because Ned Leeds in the comics was never really like him and Peter were friends, but they were never like, he's almost like written as like a Harry Osborn type in this movie. And also Flash too. And again, I think these actors did a great job. I'm not dissing their performances anyway, but I do think it's an interesting disconnect because I realized this when I was watching Far From Home, that they kind of combined Flash Thompson and Harry Osborn into one character in this movie, where he's like this rival of Peter's, but he's also this, this kid from this rich family who's kind of ignored by his parents. That's Harry Osborn all over it. So I thought that was an interesting thing, where then they take, the friendship aspect of Harry Osborn and then they mix it with Gank from who's Miles Morales' best friend in those comic books, and they combine it. And he's also kind of like an overweight guy in the Miles Morales comics, and they combine it and give him this random name from Peter's supporting cast in that. So I thought those are some interesting little twists they came, and they're not bad. It's just interesting, and I kind of wish I was there in the meetings to figure out like, what was your thought process to get from that point and these characters to what you ended up with in the movie?
Yeah, I think they've spoken about it a little bit, and I think that what it is that if Peter were alive today in a slightly heightened universe, right, he would be going to a science high school in the city, and if it was a science high school in the city, especially in Queens, it would be a very diverse community of like nerdy people, a variety of different statuses and cultures, and I think that they wanted his high school to reflect that. And I think that they do that really well. And I think what is true is that Spider-Man's high school set in the comic books back from the 60s is not really reflective of what
Right.
like a science tech high school in Queens would look like in
Mhm.
2017, right? It just isn't. But Miles's high school team is a little bit more, and so I think the idea to kind of like pull Genki from the Miles storyline, but just give him a Peter relative name
Mhm.
is probably the most craven and thing that they did from a like adaptation choice, but I think it also works the best, so it's hard to
Mhm.
argue with the Flash thing. Like I didn't go to a science tech school, but I did go to a prep school in right around the same area that he is living in, and that was exactly what the bullies were like in my prep school. It
Mhm.
was like a high status, academic achieving, non-white person with rich parents who were not attentive and put a lot of pressure on them, and so they let it out by being mean to everybody else. So for
Mhm.
me, I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly what the bully would be like today. It wouldn't make any sense for him to be this blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 6 foot tall jock playing
Mhm.
football on the quad. Like that doesn't make any sense, but having him be
Mhm.
this, where the way that Tony Rillard plays him is perfect, and
Mhm.
I love that. And I don't necessarily think that they're trying to merge him with the Harry Osborn thing. I think they just, in the first movie, they really established him as this rich kid who's mean to everybody. And then in the second movie, they were like, well, let's dig slightly deeper to say, well, why is he mean to everybody? And
Mhm.
in the first movie, you get this sort of sense of he feels intellectually insecure because he knows Peter is smarter than him. And in the second movie, you get a little bit more of like, oh, and also his parents don't really seem to care very much about him. But I don't know if that necessarily has to be a specific Harry Osborn trait. I think that that's
Mhm.
true of a lot of people in that situation. So I really love the adaptation choices, and I think it really works. And I think like Betty Brant is really fun in these movies as a character who like may or may not resemble herself in the comic books, but I think works really well as part of this ensemble. And like Liz Allen is a great the adaptation choice here. And then the MJ of it all. I think the
Mhm.
way that they seed MJ in this movie and then allow it to flourish later is just so confident in a way
Mhm.
that especially Sony Spider-Man movies rarely are. Usually they have this feeling of like we need to put everything we possibly can into these movies so that way everybody pays attention to them, and there's like a lot of insecurity there. And I think there's such confidence to be like, hey, we're going to cast Zendaya, who's a pretty big star, less of a big star in 2017 than she is now, but she was still a
Mhm.
pretty big deal then. And we're just going to have her kind of like on the corner, like on the edges of scenes, just like hanging around. She's Michelle, we don't really know what her deal is, and she constantly keeps like popping up and like she's clearly watching Peter, but we don't really, but acting like she doesn't care when clearly she does. And
Mhm.
then in Far From Home, obviously, well, now she's MJ, she's his love interest, and her his great love and everything else. But I really admire the way that they play that.
Yeah, I thought the MJ stuff. I feel like Zendaya was a much better reflection of MJ in Far From Home and No Way Home. Like she felt there. You could see aspects of that character come through her performance in those two movies. I felt, in comparison to this one, where like you said, she's just kind of like there in the background. She's there in the sides here, and her performance is great, but it didn't really feel like MJ to me. So when at the end when she says, "Oh, my friends call me MJ," I'm like, oh, so I guess this is our MJ. Okay, didn't see that coming. Um, and yeah, you make
I'm
good points, and you're
curious
right. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm curious if that changed at all for you watching this movie now, having seen the other ones. Because I remember at the time feeling a little bit random. And then
Mhm.
watching it now, having seen the whole arc and seeing the progression, it working a lot better for me and me realizing kind of the seeds that they were laying in more subtly in a way that I don't necessarily think I picked up on initially on the
Mhm.
first couple of viewings. But I'm curious if you have a similar experience.
I didn't really pick up on any of that not for me. I didn't really pick up any of that. Like I just think she's much better utilized in the other films. I did like the choice of starting off with Liz in this movie, and I think Liz has had connections to supervillains in the comic book, so I think connecting her to Vulture, of all of Peter's supporting cast, I think she's the one who feels most like a character from the comics. Like and even I think there are some aspects of the Spectacular Spider-Man TV show, the animated series, that version of Liz. There were some aspects of that in her performance as well too, I thought. So I thought they did a great job with her. And I love Ned in this movie. I do love Flash, but I did also kind of find myself thinking wistfully and like I cannot see this version of Flash Thompson becoming Agent Venom like he does in the comic books, which is a great arc for Flash Thompson. So, and also like the whole thing where he goes through this maturing aspect in the comics where him and Peter, he starts off as Peter's bully in college. They're kind of like rivals, but then then Flash ends up enlisting in the military and going off to war and comes back. And then afterwards, like him and Peter becomes like the only one from high school he can really rely on. And they become very close friends in the comics. And I think I can't see that same arc in those same ways paying off with Tony Revolori's version of Flash Thompson. So part of it is just me from the comic books thinking wistfully about what we'll probably never get to see. And I think that's a big part of it. But otherwise, I think you make some really good points about why they chose this take for Flash.
Yeah, I think that probably, when you have 60 years worth of comic books to kind of draw from, you're gonna have to make some adaptation choices that will then end up having downstream effects. And I definitely agree with you that has a downstream effect. It's a lot easier to believe like Peter's jock bully from high school then developed into a begrudging friendship, and then he went to the military, and then he became Agent Venom. Peter's like nerdy rich bully from his science high school, probably less likely to follow down that same path. But doesn't mean that he couldn't do other interesting things unexpectedly along the way that has a similar sort of like, reverse heel turn, face turn sort of thing down the road. So, adaptation choices like that close off some story potential, but it also opens up other ones. So
no, you're right. And the MCU has done a really good job with that. Like they've made some interesting choices that are very divorced from the comic books, but end up working in other ways. I mean, I think, Tony Stark's journey is one version that easily comes to mind because, in the comics, he had dealt with the whole alcoholism thing. Whereas in the movies, they didn't really, they kind of came close to hinting at it in the first two movies, but then after that, it just kind of, they instead lean more into the PTSD aspects from the first Avengers movie. And that almost like becomes his defining character trait over the course of these movies. And also like, he develops this long-term relationship with Pepper, which never happened in the comic books, but it works for those characters in this setting. And I could easily see them doing something like that with Flash and finding some different way to have that kind of the relationship develop more. Although after No Way Home, it'll be interesting to see how they can do that. But yeah, I think, you're right. You make it's a very good point. Even though we're not getting the same thing we get in the comic books, there are different ways they could play that out.
Yeah, like, I mean, you think about you talking about Iron Man more, he's such a huge part of this movie, right? And this is the sort of arc that just wouldn't have happened the same way in the comic books. Like, having Tony as a surrogate father figure to Peter doesn't make as much sense there as it does here, but it works so well here. And it really ends up being this kind of, like, emotional spine that runs throughout, like, the next, like, 5 years of movies in a lot of ways that really pays dividends, right? Like when you get to like all of the relationship work that starts a little bit in Civil War, but they don't have a lot of time for it, understandably. So they really layer it in here, I should say. And the idea of having like Tony Stark, who is like the king of daddy issues, having to become a father figure to this kid without a father figure is so ripe for opportunity. And I feel like Robert Downey Jr. really must have been so excited to get his handle on this sort of material, because he really excels at the scenes that he gets. And then it just becomes like his investment and emotional connection to Peter becomes this thing that then just, in Infinity War, obviously, he loses Peter and the guilt and grief around that ends up propelling him to kind of making that ultimate sacrifice in Endgame. And so it's such a core part of who the Iron Man as a character ends up being. And you would never have gotten any of that if you held tightly to the relationships as they were established in the comic book universe.
Right. So I want to talk about Iron Man too, because again, one of the things that really annoys me when, Spidey Twitter goes off on this movie is they dismissively call it the Iron Boy movie, because they say like, oh, Peter Parker's just, he's just Iron Man's sidekick basically. And I'm just like, did we watch the same movie? Because that's not at all what's happening in this film. And I think one brief correction there. There was a mentor-mentee relationship between Tony Stark and Peter Parker in the comic books. It just wasn't at this stage in their lives. So in the comics in the early 2000s, Spider-Man ends up joining the Avengers, and Tony kind of takes Peter under his wing because Tony's a little bit older. They have similar technological interests and scientific background. So Tony kind of takes Peter under his wing, develops some new tools for him, and he does take on a mentor role for him in those comic books. And I thought moving that to this time in Peter's life, it makes so much sense in the context of the MCU, because in the comics, if I'm not mistaken, if I'm remembering my comics timeline correctly, Spider-Man actually came out before Iron Man did. So there was no real opportunity for that relationship to happen in the comic books. But in the context of the MCU, the Avengers first appeared when Peter was, in elementary school, probably. So he would have grown up watching Tony Stark as Iron Man and seeing this guy who's using science to become a superhero and making science look cool. Like, I think that would totally influence him. I could totally see him being influenced and growing up idolizing Iron Man. In a way, in the comics, there have been stories that have been done afterwards where they kind of show like Peter growing up idolizing Captain America, because Captain America was in World War II. He grew up reading about Captain America and Captain America comic books and all that. So he grew up idolizing Captain America in the comic books. In the movies, they kind of change that and they make it Iron Man instead, which totally makes sense for this universe. So I thought all that stuff was, and there's also an element of never meet your heroes type of thing in it, right? The whole idea of like, he's, he so wants that acceptance of, and they've had different aspects of this type of relationship in the comic books too, right? Him wanting the acceptance of some older figure. And just like that constant striving to find some sort of father figure now that Ben is gone. I think they played that really well.
I'm not a comic book expert, as I've said repeatedly, but I do understand that pretty early in the first iteration of Spider-Man back in the 60s, one of his big things was wanting to join the Fantastic Four to get validated as a hero, right? And I feel like they're kind of taking that energy and bringing it into the Avengers here, which makes sense because Fantastic Four doesn't exist and Avengers have that status here. That would make a lot of sense. And I think that it captures something that's so great about these movies, and something that it does bother me a little bit when Spider-Man Twitter complains about this, because I feel like for the longest time what I heard was, the other Spider-Man movies are great, but the biggest downside is that, in the comic books, Spider-Man is just this one guy. He's a kid, a young adult, trying to make a difference in this world of superheroes, right? And he's this low status guy, like the New York tabloids are always on him for making the wrong choice and messing things up. And he's a low status superhero, right? And the movies can't really do that because he's the only hero in their universe, right? So he has to tackle the world-ending events. And the opportunity for the MCU is to re-establish that status quo of he is a low status hero who wants to be one of the Avengers but can't, like that's what his whole thing is. And it's like, I feel like these movies then do that perfectly, and then people complained about it. It was like, isn't this what you asked for?
It drives me nuts when I see all these people suddenly coming out and saying like, oh, the Amazing Spider-Man movies were so great, and they're I'm like, well, I was defending those movies back when they first came out, and I was doing it by myself. Where the hell were all of you people? And it's like, there's this weird thing where it's that whole nature of Twitter and the internet where it's like, you got to be contrary, you got to be a contrarian all the time type of thing is really what I think drives a lot of it. But and you're right. In fact, the very first issue of Spider-Man solo comic was him trying to join the Fantastic Four and him breaking into the Baxter building to try and impress them with his powers, which again is a stupid, reckless, irresponsible thing to do. But that makes sense for that character because he's always doing a stupid, irresponsible, and reckless thing and then realizing his mistake and then trying to fix it. That happens in almost every single Spider-Man story. So when people say that this Peter doesn't understand responsibility, I'm just like, well, no, he does. Like you had so accurately said, it's just he's still a kid. He still has, that youthful, impulsive, reckless nature about him. And just because he doesn't have the experience to know better. And I think that's 100% accurate.
Yeah, and I'll also just say we're making movies, and Tom Holland and Robert Downey Jr. have great chemistry together, and every scene that they're in crackles. And if you have that, use it. like
Yeah.
relax, people. Like, we're making a film within this world, and we have these incredible assets that work so well together, and you don't want to use them because you feel like it's not true to who the character was 50 years
Mhm.
ago. Like, give me a break,
Another aspect that annoys me is when people say that Uncle Ben doesn't exist in this universe. I'm like, well, no, he does. It's just that we don't have to see Uncle Ben get shot in every movie to understand that's part of Peter's backstory. Everybody knows that
Right.
origin. We've seen it in even, going back to, you mentioned the Fox animated series. They never opened up with Uncle Ben's murder. In fact, I don't even think they
No.
showed it in the first few episodes. And because they understood that we don't need to show it all the time, people understood this. In fact, in The Amazing Spider-Man, that whole, as much as I love Martin Sheen's performance in that movie, the whole sequence where he gets shot just feels so tacked on and by the numbers, like, okay, we have to do this. Let's quickly get it out of the way. Whereas it would have worked so much better if we had opened that movie with Ben already being dead and then maybe showing Martin Sheen in flashbacks would have worked much better. And this movie, we don't see Ben, but we get hints of him every single time. Like in Civil War, right? When Tony asks Peter, why do you do this? And he gives that whole speech, like, when you can do the things I can do, and you don't. And then the bad things happen. They happen because of you. It's a clunky speech, and I know, and it's obvious they were trying to write it without
Well, I
using the
love
words.
that speech.
I think it's a little
I
bit
love that
clunky.
speech because I think Tom Holland delivers it so well.
He
There's
does
such
deliver
like
it well, yeah.
sincerity, and something that I also really like about that speech is that he starts to then explain more, which is like of course, like, the fans want to know, like,
Mhm.
so what happened, like, tell us more about this and Tony, being Tony, just cuts him off immediately. He's like, yeah, I get it. Okay, you want to be
Mhm.
the guy for the stick up for the little guy. I got you.
Mhm.
And so it's like, it also kind of subverts it in a kind of fun way that's true to those characters. So
Mhm.
I love that moment.
I think you're right. They play it really well. I do feel like when they were trying to write that, they were trying to write it without using the words "great power" and "great responsibility." Though
Yeah.
it
Well, they were
it
saving
feels
it
like
up for the third one.
they're saving up for the third one. Yeah. But that's obviously a reference to Uncle Ben. Otherwise, what else would he be talking about? The bad things happening. It's clearly about Uncle Ben in this movie too.
Yeah.
When Ned's asking him why May doesn't know, and he says after everything she's been through, she couldn't handle this. Again, that's a clear reference to Uncle Ben. In fact, there was a sequence that was cut from. I don't know if it was ever filmed or if it was filmed and then cut, where the suit that Peter wore to the dance, they make reference to the fact that it was Uncle Ben's suit when he was younger. So there are all these little references to Uncle Ben in Far From Home. The suitcase has Ben's initials on it.
Yeah.
There are tons of Ben exists in this movie. We just didn't see him get shot on screen, but he absolutely
Right.
exists. He absolutely died, probably because of something Peter did. So all of that is there. It's just, the movie doesn't hold your hand. You can figure this. That's another thing that annoys me when they call it a plot hole, and that's not a plot hole.
That's
It's
not a
just,
plot hole.
yeah, exactly.
It's not what a plot hole is. People
Mhm.
People need to, like, go to school and learn what plot holes are, because the internet is filled with people calling things plot holes that are explicitly not plot holes.
It's one of my biggest annoyances. Yeah. Oh, I'm like, no, that's not a plot hole.
CinemaSins
You
has
just
ruined
don't
a
understand.
generation.
Right. Just because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's not a plot hole.
Right,
Uh,
right. Or, like, they didn't explicitly say it, but they implied it. Obviously, that was a mistake. It's like, no, maybe they actually
oh,
meant to imply it. And
yeah.
but anyway, let's not talk too much more about bad fans, because they
Yeah.
suck.
Yeah. Um,
Instead, you mentioned the kind of, like, the Ned thing, that
mhm.
speech, and with Ned, where he's talking about what Aunt May has gone through, and I love that scene so much, because I love the kind of the slow reveal of, like, Peter crawling onto the ceiling, dropping down,
Mhm.
taking off the suit, and then like Ned being there and being like, "Oh my God, you're Spider-Man," and Peter going, "No, I'm not," and he's like, "You were on the ceiling." This is so great. And then he's like, "You can't tell anybody." He's like, "I'm going to be honest with you. This is the coolest thing that's ever happened to me. There's no way I couldn't tell people." It's like such an honest, like, this is how your best friend would react if they found out
Mhm.
you were a superhero. And I think, like, there's such, like, a kind of hacky way of doing this, where it's all kind of like, "Oh, you need to keep my secret," and then it's like torture to, like, keep your secret. It's like, and Ned just, like, punctuates that completely with, like, a realism that I really
Mhm.
appreciate.
Also, I love what they did with. I think this might be my favorite version of Aunt May, with maybe the possible exception of Lily Tomlin's version in Into the Spider-Verse, because I love that version of
Sure.
where she's like Peter's Alfred in a way. But I did think that she was. I loved the way Marissa Tomei plays it here, because realistically, it doesn't really make sense for Aunt May to be this frail old woman, right? I mean, it's.
Yeah, people need
I mean, I
to
think.
relax with that as well. It's
Well, I think in
it
the
makes
comics,
no sense that
yeah.
Peter would have an 80-year-old aunt that he was living with. Like it should be a woman in her 50s and taking care of her
Mhm.
brother or sister's kids. Like that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah. In fact, I think the original intention of Aunt May in the comics was that she was supposed to be Peter's great aunt, and then over time they just made it his, his Uncle Ben, uh, Peter's father's brother, as opposed to being like his grandfather's brother or something like that. And it does. You're right. It makes so much sense for Aunt May to be younger, and she plays such a believable version of this character in this type of situation, right? She's just, struggling to get by, struggling to raise this teenage kid on her own. And you see aspects like, you know, she's not his mom. She's trying to be like the cool aunt type of thing where she's like,
Hmm.
she's like taking him to the party and stuff like that. And, and she's
And
trying
also the
to.
scene when they're like the scene where they had the confrontation late in the movie when
Mhm.
when he's coming back after the fallout with the ferry. I love that scene because that fills in so much of what we are not seeing from May's perspective, where
Mhm.
it's like she knows that she doesn't know he's Spider-Man, but she knows that he is a wreck, he's a mess, he's going through
Mhm.
something and he's lying about it and he's sneaking out of the house, and she's trying her best to do what she thinks is right, maybe do what her parents couldn't do for her by
Mhm.
giving him space to figure this out. But she's a nervous wreck and she just can't handle this anymore, and she needs him to be honest with her. And I love that moment because it breathes. There's so much about Aunt May that these movies unfortunately don't give us because they just don't
Mhm.
have the time. And I think Marissa Tomei just brings so much depth to that relationship and makes it feel specific in a way that isn't necessarily on the page, but her performance really helps bring to life.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think the line when I think you made a good point. Like that line when she says, "I used to sneak out too." That says it all right there. I was completely right with you when you were saying all that stuff. Like, well, maybe she's trying to do this in a way that her parents didn't do with her. And that line, just in that one line, she says it all right there. Like, I'm trying to do this differently than my parents did it. And just like her trying to struggle with that. And I see this as a father myself, right? Like, my kids are very young, but still I see that with like, I don't want to do things the way my parents do, but I still gotta lay down the law in some way. So there is that push and pull. I totally get that. In that moment, it makes so much sense the way she reacts.
And there's also that level of like, I'm not your mom. I'm not trying to be your mom. I'm not trying to
Mm-hmm.
replace your mom, but I am a person who's here and who cares about you and who sits up at night wondering if you're okay. And I need you to respect that. Like there's that
Mm-hmm.
tension there, which is really complicated. And this movie, unfortunately, doesn't have enough time for, but the little glimpses of it that we get, I think are great. And it makes me wish that we got more of it throughout these films instead of
I mean, I
them
think
like in Far where it's just like John Favreau is her boyfriend for a whole movie, and then it's like okay, it's like I feel like when I look at the Marissa Tomei arc, it's a real missed opportunity because there's so much there, and she really wants to communicate it in this movie, and she just doesn't get the opportunities often enough. But what she gets, phenomenal.
again, that's why I say like the best way to handle Spider-Man would be like in a TV show. Like if we get like, you know, 6 or 12 episodes of like Peter going around trying to be in high school while also dealing with the occasional supervillain, and then maybe cap it off with a big budget movie or something like that. I think that would be the perfect way to handle this character. But unfortunately, he's Marvel's arguably most recognizable character, so we're not going to get that as much
Yeah,
as I might
it's
want
like
it.
it's a question of both like budget for TV. It would be hard to
Mm-hmm.
execute this character, and then also just like the economic opportunity of a Spider-Man movie is just significantly higher than a Spider-Man
Right.
television show, and that's
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
world that we live in, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But
Another thing
I
too
know
is
I know we have to wrap up soon, but I wanted to quickly just talk about some of the set pieces before we go because
okay.
there's a couple of important moments that happen here from an action perspective that are really interesting and I think sets this movie apart from other superhero movies. We really only get one big like supervillain superhero fight, which is the climax, and even in that it's mostly kind of like Peter trying to stop a robbery, not like beat up the bad guy, and then
That's
eventually
exactly
trying
what
to
I was
save
going to
the
say
bad.
next. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, perfect. And then the other scenes that are big set pieces, it's like the ferry set piece where he's trying to arrest these guys basically, but
Mhm.
the majority of the action is around trying to save everybody from the ferry disaster that he created,
Mhm.
and then the Washington Monument thing, which has no villain in it at all. It's just this sort of like accident that he again created by accident, and trying to rescue people. And I just love the fact that this movie is so invested in establishing him as a character who is most concerned about saving people, not punching the bad guy, not
Mhm.
and especially not killing the bad guy, which is unfortunately what happens in all of the other Spider-Man movies, basically, which is not
Right.
really true to who that character is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what I love about this movie and what kind of annoyed me about a lot of the other movies is that it's always we got to save the city in some way, right? It's like there's some big event that's going to happen, it's going to destroy the whole city. Whereas this one, it's just no, I'm just trying to stop this supervillain from stealing a bunch of high tech shit. That's ultimately what it is. It's not about saving the city. It is just about stopping this robbery, and it goes to show that not every superhero movie needs to have those stakes where the whole city's going to be destroyed or the whole world's going to be destroyed. We can have a movie where it's just about stopping this plot, and it can still be very entertaining, can still be just as thrilling, can still feel just as high stakes.
Yeah, it's because it's high stakes for him. He's on the side of a
Mm-hmm.
plane. He's trying to keep this bad thing from happening without having his girlfriend's dad die in the process. Like, I don't
Absolutely.
know how if you were a real person, that's as high stakes as it gets. You don't need a giant beam shooting into the sky, letting
Mm-hmm.
demons fly through the city. Like it's if you can sell the story, if you can tell the emotion of the story, it's gonna feel high stakes no matter what. And I just love that this movie had the courage to be like, no, this is a teen hero. We're gonna give him a low stakes story that feels
Mm-hmm.
high stakes to him, and then they executed that flawlessly.
Yeah. Well, also, I think too and I know everybody wants Spider-Man as an Avenger and all that, but I've always been against that idea. And I think this movie really makes a strong argument for why Spider-Man should not be an Avenger. Not because he's not good enough, not because he hasn't earned it. None of that is true. Like he's absolutely, good enough to be up there, but that speech he gives to Tony and Happy at the end when he says, I want to be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. I want to stay close to the ground and fight for the little guy. And I think they smartly tied that in with the lesson he learns from the Vulture, where he's telling them, look, those the Avengers and all that, they don't care about guys like us. And it also made him Peter also realizes, yeah, well, if the Avengers aren't paying attention to little guys, they're also not noticing the little threats like the Vulture, right? That's why the Vulture was able to go for 8 years without any attention from the feds. So I think he's
Although it was
realized
really 5 years. They
5 years.
just
Yeah,
made a
yeah, that's
mistake
right,
in the
right, right.
movie.
You're
The
right. You're
movie
right. I
says
forgot
it's
about
8
that.
years, but
Yeah,
it's 5 years.
but it makes a very good point though that if there's and I remember there's one my late co-host Derek always talked about this one issue of Avengers where they were looking for Spider-Man, and someone said to why are we wasting time trying to find Spider-Man when he's missing, don't we have better things to do? And I think it was either Iron Man or Captain America who said it's like Spider-Man takes care of the stuff that we don't. So like for us to be able to take care of the Skrull invasions and Thanos and all that, we need someone who's being able to operate on the ground and take care of the stuff that we can't notice. And this movie makes that argument, right? When he says, "I just want to
Yeah,
be a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man."
we need somebody to stop the Grand Theft bicycle. That's
Exactly. Yeah,
important.
yeah. But I think that makes such a great argument, and also I feel like it's hard to imagine Peter as this put upon struggling middle class guy when he's got Tony Stark on speed dial too. So that's another aspect of it too. I think that's why the idea of Peter being a local hero who just tries to stay to the ground works so much better than him being a member of the Avengers. And I think this movie makes that argument very well.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think, in the Avengers movies, I like to see him there because he's a great actor and a great character. But I agree from like a storytelling perspective, it always feels better when he's on the ground handling things the way that we see him in this movie.
Well, I
And I
think
will say
Infinity
one thing
War.
that
Sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
that no, well, just one thing that goes towards that is, and we kind of allied it. We went over this moment, and I want to just double back to it because it's such a core part of this film. The kind of the moment when he's under the rubble, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
this homage. It's an homage to a classic comic book that I'm aware of that then has been homaged in other comic books for like his whole history of him being under the rubble and seeing his face and the mask and the reflection and everything like that. But in the movie itself, in this movie, it's this fantastic moment where he's literally like he is a scared kid He thinks he's going to die. He's screaming for help, right? This is way over his head. He has gotten himself, he's been making mistakes throughout the whole movie, underestimating the situation. And now he has a literal building on top of him and he is panicking. And then he sees himself in the mirror, himself in the reflection in that mask, and says, I'm going to be Spider-Man. Like, come on. And he does that kind of like, come on, Spider-Man, come on, Spider-Man. And he takes on that mantle and he becomes the hero that he needs to be, not by proving things to everyone else, not by making Tony Stark happy, not by becoming an Avenger, but by proving to himself that he has the fortitude to rise from the rubble and save the day. And that's just the best Spider-Man moment, I think, across all of the films that we've gotten. And it's excellent. It's just so great. And it's a great kind of combination of paying homage to the comic books, having a great actor in a great role and giving him the material, and having the whole movie built to that moment that works so well.
100% co-signed. And what I love too about that moment when he sees his face in the mask, like that's an iconic image of like the Peter Parker with like half his face is Spider-Man, half his face is Peter Parker. And, you know, it works in the comic books because they're showing, you know, it's artistic license and all that kind of stuff. And it's a way to show to the audience that he's struggling with those two sides of his identity, and working it into the story where like half the mask is submerged and he sees his face's reflection in the water. And it's just such a brilliant way of showcasing it. Just like too, the idea of the eyes moving. I never, you know, whenever I'd see that happen in the comic books, like his eyes move, and I'm just like, okay, that's ridiculous. Those lenses can't move like that. And then after watching the the 5 movies that preceded this one, you're just kind of like, okay, well, there feels like there's something missing in Spidey's face because those lenses can't move. And so when in Civil War, they worked into it so where the lenses are mechanical and they can adjust based on, you know, how much sensory input. That was such a brilliant in-universe way to be able to give him expressive eyes in these movies. And I thought that worked so well. It helped added so much to the character and the performance.
Yeah, I fully agree. And it works. It just conveys a lot visually that I think is necessary, and it also gives us an opportunity to leave him in the damn mask for longer than the other movies do. Because in the other movies, every time you have an emotional moment, he takes off his mask so that way he can actually act. And in this movie, they don't do that. They really only take his mask off in a meaningful moment once, right at the end when he's trying to save Vulture. And I think they save it in a way that really pays off, and it makes that moment land much more. Like when you think about like the Tobey Maguire movies, he takes that mask off every single scene, it feels like. And it's like, and it just breaks the reality of who that character is supposed to be. So I think it works really well from a storytelling perspective, as well as also feeling like true to the visual sensibility of who that character is supposed to be.
Although that did annoy me in the Avengers movies when the mask is constantly coming off. And I think that's one of the downsides of them having the nano suits, is now they can easily take the mask off whenever they want.
Yeah, I know. But he's in space. He doesn't need to protect his eyes.
Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I think overall, like I think I would say that this is definitely my favorite Spider-Man movie. I think it combines all those different aspects of what you want a great Spider-Man story to have, and it's got the Peter Parker struggling with his life and struggling to balance the superhero aspect with his regular day-to-day life. You've got the supervillain that's you know somewhat comically coincidentally connected to Peter's personal life as well, and you've got him just, you know, being a local superhero basically. I think this movie completely captures what I love about Spider-Man.
Yeah, and for me, I think it might not be the best movie starring Peter Parker as Spider-Man, but it is the best Spider-Man movie.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. All right, Alex. Well, thanks so much for coming on. So, do you have any final things you want to say about this movie?
I just wanted to also briefly compliment Michael Giacchino's score. I think it's fantastic. He had a really steep hill trying to kind of like, you know, one up Danny Elfman in the original, and I think that he did just an excellent job. It really works throughout, like just from the start of the movie where you get the Spider-Man theme over the Avengers like Marvel Studios logo, and then off to the races throughout the whole film. I think it's just an expertly crafted score that I really, really like. I think it's underrated, honestly.
That instrumental version of the Spider-Man theme is just perfect. I thought that was when I saw this in the theater, like when they started playing that theme, I got chills when they started playing that theme, and I wasn't even a fan of
Yeah,
that
me too.
old cartoon, but that's still like that theme is so iconic. Um,
Yeah.
Also, one other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot too. I love that they got Jennifer Connelly to play Karen, the suit lady in this,
Yeah.
because for anyone who doesn't know, Jennifer Connelly is married to Paul Bettany, who now he's Vision, but before that he was Jarvis. So bringing in that meta aspect to it, I thought was a nice little touch. And I was kind of disappointed that we didn't see her in any of the other movies.
Yeah, I think she works really well here in moments where Peter really needs somebody to talk to, but just doesn't have anybody. And in the comics, maybe, or in the cartoon, it would have just been like this voiceover narration that wouldn't have felt at place here. You get him having someone to talk to, but I think it's also the right call in future movies to not have her back, because I just don't think that he needs to have a voice in his suit telling him what is happening across the street. I feel like that's not necessarily who Spider-Man should be. So I think it's very well used here, and I think it's very smart that they don't continue to use her in the future, even though the performance is great.
Yeah, you make a good point. I mean, I can definitely understand why it would be not necessary in the other movies, although I just love Jennifer Connelly and I want to see her in anything.
Sure.
So.
Well, I mean, see Top Gun Maverick for why she is the most
exactly. Yeah, well
of
said.
her era.
Oh God, such an underrated actress, I feel.
Yeah.
Anyway, so Alex, thanks so much for coming on the show. Why don't you tell people where they can find your podcast and the other stuff you do?
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure. You can follow me. A good place to find all of my links is on Twitter. I don't really post that much there anymore, but I do like to keep up where you can find me over there. So that's at Media Thinkings on Twitter. I have a Letterbox, which is a film specific social media site where you can follow all of my written reviews and comic book rankings over there. That's also at Media Thinkings on Letterboxd. My film podcast is actually coming to an end, so you can definitely check out our back episodes at Cinema Joe's on Twitter, Cinema Joe's on all major podcast platforms, but we're not going to be putting out any new episodes moving forward. But you can definitely subscribe to Pop Break TV to listen to my TV podcast, which I didn't discuss here. And you can also follow Pop Break Today, where you can find my Bill versus the MCU podcast, which comes out the second Tuesday of every month. So definitely check that out as well.
Okay, great.
We did an episode on all of the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies.
Okay, yeah, so definitely check that out. And we'll have links to that in the show notes. So we'll make sure to send me an email afterwards. We'll talk off mic and make sure we get all those links set up for you. But yeah, everybody else, check those out in the show notes. Check out those shows. Alex, thanks again for coming on. Welcome back anytime you'd like to talk about MCU or anything else. Anyway, that does it for this episode of Superhero Cinephiles. SuperheroCinephiles.com is the website. We are Super Cinema Pod on Twitter and Instagram. I'm also on Hive under Per Constantine, PER Constantine, and hopefully going to be using that more since Elon Musk is a psychopath. So you can find us there. And yeah, let us know what you think. And if you subscribe to the Patreon, you get these episodes a week in advance. And you also get access to the Superhero Cinephiles Book Clubs episodes, where we talk about comic books and graphic novels about once a month. Thanks so much for listening, and we will talk to you next time. If you enjoyed the Superhero Cinephiles, then you'll also love my companion podcast, the Superhero Cinephiles Book Club. All my Patreon subscribers get access to this exclusive podcast where I review superhero comics and graphic novels. Not sure what comics you want to read next or what you should dive into? I've got you covered on that. I'll be doing reviews, recommendations, and also talking to you about useful entry points if you're interested in reading some comics but don't know where you should start. Plus, you'll get access to all episodes of the main show a week before everyone else. On all of this for as little as just $1 a month. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/supercinemapod and you can sign up at any subscription amount to get started. Thanks so much for your support, and please don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you for listening, and as always, good night, good evening, God bless.